This is case study for EDL 850, Copyright in the Computer, Regulations Governing Technology. Section 1, Facts about the case. St. Regis School is a small, rural K-8 school with approximately 420 students. Software programs that were purchased using funds partially secured through a PTA fundraiser at St. Regis were initially used exclusively in the computer lab adjacent to the library. Several teachers asked Mrs. Lynn, the library media specialist, if the software programs could be installed on computers in their classrooms to give students greater access. Mrs. Lynn, with the help of the PTA president, Mrs. Evans, made the copies and distributed them. Mrs. Brandon, a new third grade teacher, questioned the legality of the copies when Mrs. Lynn delivered the program to her classroom and later approached me, the principal, with her concerns. I agreed with Mrs. Brandon that it was inappropriate and discussed the situation with Mrs. Lynn the next day. Mrs. Lynn was upset when I informed her that the practice was in violation of copyright law and would need to be discontinued. So what didn't happen? Mrs. Lynn subjected the school and herself to possible legal action. I also wish she would have spoken with me about her plan prior to making copies of the software. I will need to notify the superintendent and the software company or companies about the infringement and my plan to address it. Section 2, Legal or Ethical Issues. Obviously, Mrs. Lynn harmed the software companies who produced the technology that she copied. She has also potentially harmed the school with the prospect of a lawsuit. Ethically, it is my duty to make sure the problem is resolved and to protect the school and staff. Section 3. I have been informed of a violation of the Copyright Act by a staff member and must take steps to protect my students, staff, and school district. Section 4. Some potential missing facts. The case study does not mention the superintendent, but he or she would need to be informed. We know that several teachers requested copies and that Mrs. Williams was delighted to receive the copied program, but we were not informed about the feelings of the rest of the staff. The PTA president helped Mrs. Lynn make the copies, but we know very little else about her. And then, does the district have an attorney that should be asked for advice on how to proceed? While copyright law is generally a federal issue, it'd be wise to see if any state laws were also potentially broken. And then programs, does the board have a policy on copyright law? Does it have an acceptable use policy? What do those say? Are there any exemptions on the software for schools? Could we purchase a site license so that it could be used in multiple classrooms? Section 5, I prioritize the information. First, there is the copyright violation that could negatively impact the school and Mrs. Lynn. Mrs. Lynn was acting in the best interest of the school and students. Mrs. Brandon did the right thing in expressing her hesitancy to Mrs. Lynn and then to me. Since Mrs. Evans, the PTA president, assisted Mrs. Lynn with the copyright infringement, I'll need to discuss the matter with her and make sure she understands the implications. And then the superintendent will need to be included in the discussions or at least be aware of the situation. Lastly, I'll need to check with the board policies for further guidance on copyright or acceptable use. Section 6. After speaking with Mrs. Lynn about the situation, I have developed 3 options. The first option is basically to take no action. I will not discuss the situation with anyone and hope that the violation is not reported or discovered. If Mrs. Brandon objects, she is not required to use the software in her classroom. I will not notify the superintendent. The second option is to confiscate and destroy the copies, but limit the exposure to those who are already involved, with the exception of notifying the superintendent, which I would do. And then the third option is to, again, destroy the copies and inform all of the stakeholders of the importance of following copyright law. I would also inform the software company of the error and steps that are being taken to rectify the mistake. Section 7, the pros and cons. First, for option 1, The pros are that students would have greater access to the programs and that the district would be saved money that the PTA had helped to earn. The cons are that it is actually ethically wrong and illegal, and that we have the potential to be sued by the software companies. With those being found out or discovered, Mrs. Lind and or I could possibly be fired, and then it might lead to other stakeholders feeling free to act unethically. The pros and cons to option number 2. I would have acted legally and ethically to protect the school and staff. Students will still have access to the computer programs just in the library. Those involved will be better informed about copyright law and our school policies, and my relationship with Mrs. Brandon will be strengthened by me listening to her and following her advice or her suggestions. The cons would be there's still the potential for litigation since we did make copies. Mrs. Lind may be disgruntled and treat me or Mrs. Brandon differently. Mrs. Evans may not understand why the programs are not being used, why the PTA money is not being used appropriately in her mind maybe. And then Mrs. Lind may still face some disciplinary action. In section or option 3, the pros again that I have acted legally and ethically. Students still have access. Staff and PTA know that I expect things to be handled ethically. Again, Mrs. Brandon and my relationship will be strengthened, and all stakeholders will be better aware of the copyright law. The cons are very similar to option 2 as well, with the potential for litigation, and Mrs. Lind being disgruntled still, and Mrs. Evans maybe negative reactively, and Mrs. Lind facing disciplinary action. Section 8. After careful consideration, I've decided to go with option 3. Doing so is the best plan legally and ethically. It is what is best for students and staff and the school as a whole. I'd be disappointed in myself if I did not take every action available to make the situation right and protect my building and my people. Section 9, there are a few possible ramifications to my course of action. While my staff and the PTA president will be better informed and understand the consequences of violating copyright, the school and Mrs. Lind may still be sued, and Mrs. Lind, although she was acting in the best interest of students, may still need to be reprimanded. It is my hope that self-reporting and taking action will prevent any legal trouble. I have also demonstrated ethical leadership. Who else needs to know? The superintendent, as I've mentioned before, will need to be notified and possibly involved in the decision making, and then legal representation might also be necessary. And how to deal with the people involved, I will need to reiterate to Mrs. Lind that I appreciate her resourcefulness and desire to save the school money while offering the best learning experience for students. But breaking the law and subjecting the school to legal action is not an option. I will try to convince her that Mrs. Brandon was merely looking out for the school when she informed me of the copies, and I would probably have found out anyway, and the result would have been the same. I will talk to Mrs. Brandon and assure her that she did the right thing and to come with me with any future concerns. I will talk to Mrs. Evans and make certain she knows how much we appreciate the efforts of the PTA and all the funds that they provide for our student activities and student learning. And lastly, I will request that the staff come to me with any potential legal or ethical issues in the future in order to avoid this being in the same position. I have also included my standard correlation, my relevance, my reflection, and a couple of references that I used. Thank you for your attention.